The Wars of Religion, a period extending from 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, to 1648, the Peace of Westphalia. Now, this is a very confusing period, but the first way to organize your knowledge is to realize that there are three major wars of religion. The French Wars of Religion, the 80 Years' War, which is also the Dutch Wars of Religion, and the 30 Years' War, which is basically in the Holy Roman Empire. Let's begin with the first one, the French Wars of Religion. The first thing to know about France is that for a long time it has had a difficulty making itself a powerful monarchy. During the Middle Ages, they always kind of felt inferior to England, and rightly so, because as you can see, France is covered with lots of different principalities and counties and things like that. It's basically ruled by nobles. During the High Middle Ages, they managed to get pretty strong, but the Valois dynasty has traditionally been weak. They were the ones that lost a lot of land to the English in the Hundred Years' War, and they were the ones that the Dukes of Burgundy especially often flouted and acted as almost co-rulers. However, at the time that we're beginning right now, they're particularly strong under King Francis I, whom you see right here, King Francis I. Now, King Francis I, like a lot of the kings before him, was at war with the Holy Roman Empire, mainly for the domination of northern Italy. And in those wars, at one time, France basically cornered the Pope at one point. It would be Pope, just give me 1 second, Clement the Seventh, I believe. No, sorry, Pope Leo the Tenth. Oh yeah, here he is right here. And in one occasion, basically he got the upper hand over Pope Leo X, who had allied himself with the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire, and the two of them agreed on the Concordat of Bologna, which is going to be an important French document, the Concordat of Bologna. The basic terms of this Concordat of Bologna were that France would stop opposing the Pope and stop supporting conciliarism. This was in the year 1516. From now on, there would be an exchange. France would support the papacy at all times and not support conciliarism, the idea that the councils were higher than the Pope. But the exchange was the Pope would let France name its own bishops from now on, an idea that becomes associated with this term, just give me 1 second here, the term Gallicanism. Gallicanism is basically the idea that in France, the king names bishops. And that meant that the French kings are really going to control the church within France. This became such a deal that even entire noble families would be granted bishoprics to take care of in France, something we're going to see later. So, for example, if the king wanted to reward a friend, he would say, "Hey, friend, from now on, your family is responsible for supplying the bishops of the bishopric of blank." I'll give an example. The bishopric of Richelieu is an example, which we'll see later. But that was basically the situation in France. Now, there was a side that the French were supposed to hold. Basically, King Francis was supposed to support the papacy, and technically that meant that Huguenots were not supposed to be allowed in France. That is, French Protestants were not supposed to be allowed. But King Francis I did not enforce that because of his constant wars with the Habsburgs. Ideally, this is the idea basically. If Francis I persecuted Huguenots in France, then the Protestants in Germany would not be on his side when Francis would fight against the Habsburgs in Germany. So in order not to alienate the Protestants in Germany, Francis I had a policy of not persecuting the Protestants in France. However, this all changed in the year 1534 with an event known as the Affair of the Placards in 1534. Here's basically what went down.
Quel bon matin! Sacre bleu, c'est les Huguenots, ça ne va pas!
Okay, so basically what happened was the Huguenots left all kinds of placards in what's known as today as the Affair of the Placards in 1534. They left all kinds of posters making fun of Catholic doctrine, and they even left one poster on the king's own door. Now, this made Francis I feel very insecure, and it totally changed his mind about the Huguenots. Basically, there began a persecution of the Huguenots. It was not allowed in the empire, which is strictly what was required by the Concordat of Bologna anyway. So there's the persecution of the Huguenots. This, if you notice, is the same year that John Calvin left France. Calvin used to live in France, and he left France for Geneva in this same year, as we saw before. Now, this policy continued during the reign of Francis I, but then it also would continue under his son, Henry II, who succeeded him. Francis I died in the year, just give me 1 second, in the year 1547, and his son took over in the year 1547 as well. And Henry II was his name. Henry II continued that policy. Henry II continued the policy for a completely different reason than his father did. Henry II was losing the wars against the Habsburgs. He was losing the Habsburg-Valois wars. Basically, at this point, it would be mainly his main contender was against Philip II. That's who he was mainly fighting against. Just give me a second to undo that. I can't seem to undo that. Okay, very good. But he was mainly losing the wars against Philip II. So in order not to incur the wrath of Philip II, he continued the policy of persecuting the Huguenots, as you can see in this picture right here. At first, it was just a matter of confiscation of property, but eventually it elevated through taking away positions and things like that, and eventually even burning at the stake, as you can see in this picture. Now, this continued until Henry II died. But before the cause of his death was actually, in a way, the end of the Habsburg-Valois Wars. In the year, just give me 1 second, in the year 1559, the wars finally ended with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. At the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis, the Habsburgs and the Valois finally made peace. As you can see in this picture, they're finally shaking hands, and that was the end of the Habsburg-Valois Wars. Now, that's no big deal. That's happy news. But then, what happened to the king? Well, the king, in order to celebrate, decided to have a joust. And in this joust, he himself participated. However, it ended up being his death. In the joust, the captain of his Scottish Guard, Lorges, accidentally stabbed him right in the helmet. It went into his visor and stabbed him near the eye, stabbed the king in the head. And the king eventually fell down, and he died of the bleeding from his head later. So that was the end of Henry II. And that opens up big problems. Well, the main problem was that he was succeeded by his son, Francis II, whom we've heard of before. This is the sickly king. He's only 16, who was also married to Mary, Queen of Scots. Do remember that. He was married to Mary, Queen of Scots, whom we've seen before. The only problem is that Francis's reign did not last long at all. He basically died pretty shortly afterwards. He died in the year, let's see, he died in the year, just give me 1 second, I believe 1560. Yes, he died in the year 1560. And so his father died in 1559. He himself died in 1560. Now, the death of Francis II caused some problems because, as you can see, he and his wife, Mary, Queen of Scots, had no children. Now, Francis does have tons of brothers, as you can see here. He has at least 3 brothers, and in all there were 10 children of King Henry II and Catherine de' Medici. And that all these children belong to the Valois dynasty, which is the ruling house of France. The Valois dynasty right now is the royal house, so that's kind of their main power base, is that they're the royal house. But also, they are Catholic, but they're also not militant Catholics. They're basically known as politiques. That is, that they prize state order over religion. They would rather have a strong monarchy than have everybody be Catholic. But the one problem is this. The problem is Salic law. Salic law normally doesn't trace through the lateral line, that is, going by brothers on the side. Lateral means side. Normally, Salic law works in the direct line. In other words, you're supposed to go straight down. And if you follow the direct line, now just give me a second here, if you follow the direct line, then really a better claim might be had by the Bourbon house, which is down here. This is the Bourbon house. The Bourbons are basically go all the way back to Louis IX of France. If you go all the way back to St. Louis IX of France, One branch of St. Louis IX, of descent from St. Louis IX, goes down to the Valois, but the next line goes down to the Bourbons. However, there's some problem with the Bourbons. Right now, they already have the title of Kings of Navarre. Navarre proper belongs to Spain, but Gascony is still kind of their inheritance, and they just keep the title King of Navarre, even though they've really lost Navarre proper. Henry Bourbon right here was the first one to win that title as King of Navarre, and he won it through his wife, who inherited it actually, Jeanne d'Albret. That's her name right there. This is Jeanne d'Albret. But there's another thing about this house. Jeanne d'Albret was a Huguenot, and she managed to convert, that is a French Calvinist, and she managed to convert her husband to the Huguenot faith, and they're raising their son, also named Henry. He's going to be known as Henry IV, so I'll just say that now, but right now you can just call him Henry. They raised him Huguenot as well, which means they're not even Catholic. Nevertheless, they have a certain legitimacy so far as the direct line is concerned. So you have the Valois and the Bourbons. These are going to be two families that are going to end up fighting a lot during these wars of religion. But there's a third family. There's the House of Guise that you see represented right here. Their main power base is the fact that they are married into the Royal House of Scotland. That is the Stuarts. And that gives them a certain clout at the French court, especially since the Stuarts are also married into the Valois. Basically, the way it works is this. The patriarch of the house is Francis de Guise, Duke Francis. And his sister was Mary de Guise. She married King James V of Scotland. That's who that is. This is James V of Scotland, one of the Stuarts. And their daughter was Mary, Queen of Scots, who married Francis II. So you get the idea. They're also related to the royal house now, related to the Valois. But then probably their biggest strength was that they were militant Catholics. That is, they were not only Catholic, but they thought that Catholicism was something that the King of France was supposed to ensure, that Catholic legitimacy to rule, was bound up with fighting for the Catholicism. Not wavering. Legitimacy to rule is bound up with vindicating Catholicism. And so in a certain sense, they're going to be a stronger, in a certain sense, they have a stronger appearance than how the Valois house does. Especially if you consider this. Most of France is Catholic. About 10% is Huguenot right now. And the Huguenots are mainly concentrated in the upper middle class, and in the lower nobility. But most of France is Catholic, and this basically is a very attractive position that the Guises have. You can see it right here in this map that shows their basic power base. Let me bring the map to the front real quick. There we go. And you can see Bourbon House, of course, has its center down here in Navarre, or Gascony. And you can see their other possessions right here. There are Huguenots that are growing, but that's still only 10% of the population. The Guises really control all the main Catholic areas. And of course, the Valois have Paris, but that's about it. You can see that even though the Guises don't have a direct claim, they do have a lot of clout because of their militant Catholicism. Now, in the end, the one who eventually wins is the Valois. The Valois decide to follow the lateral line, so if you follow that, they're going to go through the brothers one by one. And our next king, after the death of Francis, who's now dead, our next king will be Charles IX, his brother. So he becomes the next ruler. Unfortunately, Charles IX is still young and weak, and as you're going to see, all three of these brothers are really going to be controlled by their mother, Catherine de' Medici, whom the name you might recognize. She is indeed related to the Medicis of Florence, and the Medicis of Florence have not been having a great time lately. So she was married to the King of France by the help of her her great uncle, Pope Clement VII. You might remember Pope Clement VII de' Medici. He was the one who got her married to the King of France, and now she is going to use France as a way to kind of glorify the de' Medici household, since they've lost their basic clout in Florence. Now, she has a bad rap, and that's true. There's a good reason for a bad rap. For instance, during her regency over her three sons, there's going to be a lot of poisoning people, a lot of political assassinations, things like that. So in a certain sense, she deserves it. However, When it comes to religion, she at first took a very politique approach, and that she basically wanted to keep the peace at first. And that's especially true in the January Edict. In the January Edict, she granted the right to Huguenots to basically exist. There was a tolerant edict, and not only that, it said they could meet in outside the cities. They could meet on Sundays outside cities, so they were allowed to do that. This was in the year, just give me 1 second, this is in the year 1562. However, that very same year, the Guises did not like this at all. Basically, here you go right here, just give me 1 second. Basically, as some Huguenots were meeting at a barn in Oisy-sur-Blaise, a party led by the Guises came and basically, let's see, just give me a second. Here's Francis de Guise right here. Massacred several Huguenots in the year 1562. 1562. This is the massacre at Oisy-sur-Blaise. That's basically the start of the French Wars of Religion, because violence has broken out. The Guises came and just killed all these Huguenots. The Huguenots realized it's time to gather up arms and defenses. So under the leadership of the Bourbons, basically the Bourbons take the lead here, but the military, they basically take turns with various military generals. The first leader that tries to protect them is Louis, Prince of Condé. He's basically their first military leader of the Huguenots. However, as the wars continue, he dies in the year, just give me a second here. He dies in 1570. Under his leadership, the wars had continued. And once he dies, his role as military leader of the Huguenots is taken over by a guy we're going to have a lot of occasion to talk about, Gaspard de Coligny. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny becomes the new military protector, so to speak, of Huguenots. Nevertheless, the war continues with much bloodshed on both sides. Now, until, of course, we get to the year 1572. There is one thing I should also mention. Gaspard de Coligny basically wins over Charles IX. He heavily influences the king, Charles IX, and influences him to help support, to make an alliance with the Dutch, who are also basically fighting their own wars of religion right now, as we'll see in a second. Now, once that happens, once Gaspard de Coligny wins over the king to the Protestant side, guess who's going to be angry? You bet, it's going to be Catherine de' Medici, who now also made an alliance with the Guises. So here's the thing. This is when Catherine de' Medici basically decides no more of this nice approach. She decides to ally herself with the Guise family, and so she allies herself with the militant Catholic side. And as we're going to see, this explains her later actions, which come in the year 1572. In that year 1572, the two houses of Bourbon and Valois tried to make peace when Henry Bourbon, the kid we saw before, this is him over here, Henry Bourbon, the son of Jean d'Albret and the other Henry, married Margaret of Valois, or Marguerite, if you want to do it in the French, the sister of the kings we've had so far, the two kings. It was a very happy wedding, and it seemed that everything was going to be okay. But what the wedding did was bring a lot of Huguenots into Paris. There's lots of Huguenots in Paris at this wedding. And so tensions are high. And of course, those Huguenots are going to bring their military leader, Gaspard. They're not going to go without military support. So Gaspard himself was there. Now the wedding went without a hitch. So far, so good. We seem to be happy. However, the next day, the day after the wedding, something bad happened. Just give me a second. I'm trying to find the thing that okay, let me just get these out of the way. Something bad happened, as you'll see here in this. As Gaspard de Coligny was walking around celebrating, or happy about that the wedding went off without a hitch. Just give me 1 second. They tried, basically, and an attempt was made on his life.
Mais, blesse mon cœur.
Okay, this was a big problem, as you saw at the end of that video. Okay, if we just back up for a second in that video, you can see that he lost his elbow, and basically his elbow, the bullet shot knocked off a couple of his fingers. You can see here. Let's see if I've got, yeah, knocked off a couple of his fingers and also smashed his elbow, but he did not die. However, the gunshot came from a house that belonged to the Guises, and so that was very suspicious. This, of course, accelerated the war, and Catherine de' Medici panicked. She's like, oh my gosh, the Guises, or oh my gosh, the Guises have attacked the house. What are we going to do? And basically she panics. This is me drawing her panicking here. She's going, oh! I make her sad. There we go. She's very sad, and she's panicking. So, according to the main theory, she ordered a preemptive strike of all the Huguenot leaders at once. And this led to the worst event in these French wars of religion, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Just give me a second, I gotta get rid of this big black thing. There we go. Basically, what started out as just an attempt to get the Huguenot leaders ended up in a huge bloodbath with lots of violence on all sides. The Catholics suddenly got into a big frenzy, and they started to go around killing Protestants everywhere, not just the leaders, but all kinds of Huguenots. As you can see in this picture, they ran up to the room where Gaspard de Coligny was being held sick. They threw him out the window, his body fell into the street, and immediately they cut off his head, as you can see right here. And if you notice closely in this picture, there's Catherine de' Medici inspecting the damage. 30,000 Protestants were possibly killed in this event, first in Paris and in the surrounding region. And just massive bloodshed without cause, without any reason. Lynchings, murders, men, women, and children. It was a terrible event. And it, of course, gave a bad impression of Catholicism in this particular war. It was definitely a low point in these wars of religion. Again, this was, just give me a second here, it was 1572, a date to know, the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Henry himself, the guy who got married at the wedding that started this whole thing, he himself barely survived by promising to convert to Catholicism, which he promptly did. Now, of course, this massacre didn't help any with the relationships between Huguenots and Catholics, and so the war raged on. It raged on between the three families. Right now, the Guises and the Valois seem to be together, but that wouldn't always be true, especially when we enter the last phase of the war, the phase of the three Henrys, or the phase of the War of the Three Henrys. It's called that because the leaders of all three families eventually become called Henry. Here they are one by one. First of all, Charles IX died in the year, just give me 1 second here, in the year 1574, so 2 years after the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. So once he died, the next person to take over was his brother. His brother took over again, and that is Charles that is Henry III. Henry III representing the House of Valois, King Henry III of France. The Bourbon side, of course, is now led by the guy who just got married, Henry, who we'll call Henry of Navarre. That's his basic title, Henry of Navarre. Sorry about those two lines there. And Henry of Navarre has recently, Henry of Navarre has come back to his fellow religionists. He basically converted to Huguenots again. Even though he became Catholic, he became Huguenot again once he was safe in Navarre in the year 1576. The third side, the Guises, were taken over by Duke Henry of Guise. As you notice, everybody's named Henry at this time, it seems, who took over for his father. Just give me 1 second. There he is, Duke Henry of Guise, who took over for his father, Francis, when his father died, and became the head of the Guise family in the year 1584. Not only that, but he and his father is now the leader of the Catholic League, a league that was formed, basically led by the Guises, to fight against not only the Bourbons, but also the Valois, whom they see as weak. Basically, at this time, Henry shows himself as the strong ruler, as opposed to Henry III of Valois, who's known for his effeminacy. He surrounds himself with girly men in the French court, and he's not really fighting for the religion. Whereas Henry of Guise shows himself as the strong Catholic ruler and flouts the fact that he himself is descended from Charlemagne. So even though this War of the Three Henrys is originally about a war of religion, and you would think that they would fight the Protestants, it ends up becoming more of a war between these two Henrys, the militant Catholic Duke de Guise, leader of the Catholic League, and Henry III. This war escalates at the Day of the Barricades. This Day of the Barricades was a rather complicated endeavor to basically siphon off French support from the Dutch. The Dutch right now are in their wars of religion with the Spanish, and right now the Spanish are also allied with the Guise family. This is mainly due to the work of the Spanish ambassador Bernardino de Mendoza, whom you see right here. Bernardino de Mendoza did not really ally with the House of Valois because the House of Valois isn't particularly Catholic. He allied with the Guises, and they had a plan that would basically try to distract the French from supporting the Dutch, and also at the same time distract the English from supporting the Dutch. It was all a coordinated plan that was supposed to take place in the year 1588. The plan was basically this. Henry of Valois, King Henry III, had banished the Duc de Guise from Paris, and so he told him not to come into Paris. But the Duc de Guise came anyway, and when the king gave orders for his arrest, the Duc de Guise basically had his fellow Parisians, these strong Catholics, barricade every single street of Paris around his house. They basically started breaking furniture, bringing it out, and stacking it all up so that the king's soldiers could not come to arrest him. This, of course, is something we're all familiar with, but it was the first time it was done in the history of France, the Day of the Barricades, 1588. Now, you might think that sounds familiar, that date sounds familiar, and that's because, due to Bernardino de Mendoza's idea, it was supposed to be coordinated with the attack on the English, the Spanish Armada. Now, that one, as you know, turned out to be a complete disaster, but both ordered the same thing. The Armada was meant to prevent English aid from going to the Dutch in their wars of religion, and the Day of the Barricades was meant to distract the French from sending their support to the Dutch as well. Now, what was the upshot of this? Well, basically, it was successful. The Duc de Guise was not captured by the king's soldiers, and not only that, the people of Paris all said, "Hail the Duc de Guise, let's make him the king." And he very magnanimously said, "No, no, no, I'm not the king. The King Henry of Valois is king. We'll take good care of him." And they basically kept the king in house arrest in Paris. Now, what was the end result of this was that the king escaped anyway. King Henry III of Valois escaped anyway, and eventually, a year later, in the same year, in 1588, he eventually called Henry of Guise to come meet with him so they could work out some compromise. And when they did, his men assassinated him. King Henry III assassinated Henri Duc de Guise, and now that took care of the Guise problem. The one Henry is out of the way. That took care of one Henry, Henri de Guise, assassinated by King Henry III Valois. However, the Valois were about to fall as well, because in that same year, in the year 1589, the next year, Catherine de' Medici died in January, so she's out of the picture. Croak, gone. But also in that same year, the Guises had some supporters, despite the fact that they're basically out of power now. There was one major supporter, a radical Dominican friar named Jacques Clement. Jacques Clement, as you can see here, he's receiving communion and going to confession before he does a daring deed. Jacques Clement requested a special audience with the king, King Henry III, and when they got together, he stabbed him in the stomach, basically assassinated the king. The king took a while to die, but here you see him on his deathbed. He does eventually die. Incidentally, Jacques Clement was eventually caught, and he died a horrible death. He was drawn and quartered. They tied his 4 limbs to 4 horses, and the horses were prodded in different directions, and they tore apart his body as they cut open his stomach, and eventually he was literally torn limb from limb. So that took care of the Valois. There are no more Valois. Their 4th brother had already died a while ago. We'll see a story about him later. And so the Bourbons now have the main claim to the throne. And so Henry of Navarre, the son that we've seen several times, claimed the throne. Henry of Navarre claims the throne of France and would become Henry IV, King of France. However, there was one small problem. He was still Huguenot. And when he tried to come to Paris, the Catholics barred him from entering Paris. And he realized that this was going to be the way it was as long as there were militant Catholics in France. So in 1593, he made a very pragmatic decision. He converted to Catholicism. He didn't want to alienate the majority religion of the country. Most of Catholic, again, 90% is still Catholic, so he converted to Catholicism. His words are famous. Paris vaut bien une messe. Paris is well worth a mass. That's his famous line. 1593, he converted to Catholicism, and in 1594, they let him into Paris, and he became officially the king. Now, even though he converted to the majority religion of France, this was a big scandal to the Pope and to the Spanish. The Pope and the Spanish were like, a Bourbon on the throne, how can we let this happen? And the Spanish and the Pope began to offer their support to the Guises to take back the throne of France. However, this met with wide, popular lack of support in France, because even though most of France is Catholic, and this guy was, his Catholic adherence is iffy at best, the fact is Henry IV was very popular. The French called him Good King Henry. He was handsome. He had very good. He was very charismatic, and he just seemed to be a symbol for peace after these wars of religion. You can see that very well in this picture right here. Just give me a second as I get to make some room for me here. This picture right here. This picture that makes him look like Hercules. Hercules killing the Lernaean Hydra. That Lernaean Hydra, well, of course, the Hercules is Henry. That's Henry IV right there. And that Lernaean Hydra is supposed to be the Catholic League. So basically, he stamped out, just by his popularity, the Guises basically fall by the wayside. The Spanish support does not come, and the papal support does not come because the French side with their king. The wars are almost over. Now, with his clout, Henry doesn't forget his former co-religionists, the Huguenots. So the last thing he does, just give me a second while I make some space here. The last thing that we're going to see him do, he's not dead yet, but the big thing that he does is in the year 1598. This is a key date here. He proclaims the Edict of Nantes, which basically grants tolerance to Huguenots. They're now allowed to exist. These French Calvinists are now allowed to exist in France. But not only that, he grants them fortified cities and the right to gather arms. And all of this at the royal expense. They're basically subsidized. These projects are subsidized by the state. His reasoning was very simple. In France, it's not enough to just allow Huguenots to exist. They obviously need protection. And so they have to have the right to bear arms to protect themselves from the militant Catholics. And so the Edict of Nantes is a key thing here, both in the idea of the need to bear arms to protect yourself, but also in the Calvinist resistance theory. This definitely helps give credence to the Calvinist resistance theory, that theory whereby that Calvinists tend to have, where you have the right to violently oppose unjust rulers. I mean, here it is, the king saying, go ahead and gather arms, you Christian Calvinists. So you see that that thing we talked about before definitely is given a lot of a shot in the arm by this whole idea of this Edict of Nantes, gathering arms to protect yourselves. But for now, there was peace, and the French wars of religion are over, and they will stay pretty much the same, well, until the next king.